fastest way to lose control of a conversation may be to answer the question you were asked. That sounds defensive and it sounds dishonest. After all, responsible people answer questions, leaders provide explanations, and professionals respond directly. But the principle assumes the question itself is honest. And many questions are not. Some questions are not designed to discover information, they're designed to establish a conclusion before you begin speaking. Something like, why did you fail to prepare the team? Or when did you stop taking the project seriously? Or why are you being so defensive? Or do you always struggle with accountability? Every one of those questions contains an accusation disguised as curiosity. And the moment you answer it directly, you may accept the accusation. You begin explaining why you failed to prepare the team, even though the team may have been prepared. You try to prove that you took the project seriously, even though nobody has established otherwise. You defend yourself against being defensive, which almost always makes you appear more defensive. This is one of the most subtle power shifts in communication. The person asking the question is not merely requesting an answer. They are defining the reality in which your answer must exist. And once you accept that reality, they control the conversation. Every question contains a premise. Sometimes the premise is harmless, like, what time does the meeting begin? The premise is that there is a meeting. Or, which proposal do you prefer? The premise is that you have reviewed more than one proposal. But other questions contain premises that are incomplete, misleading, or deliberately hostile. Why did your plan create so much confusion? The hidden premise is that your plan created the confusion. Or why are you unwilling to compromise? The hidden premise here is that you are the unreasonable person preventing agreement. Why should anyone trust your judgment after this? The hidden premise is that your judgment has already been discredited. Most people hear the accusation, feel pressure, and immediately begin constructing a defense. That response feels responsible because we have been trained to answer what we are asked. But under pressure, directness can be submissive. You can answer clearly and still surrender the frame. You can speak confidently and still reinforce a false story. You can provide perfect evidence and still lose, because the evidence is being interpreted inside a premise that already makes you guilty. This does not mean you should refuse every uncomfortable question. Difficult questions are necessary. Leaders should be challenged. Experts should explain themselves. People who make consequential decisions should be accountable. But accountability does not require accepting an inaccurate premise. There's an enormous difference between refusing scrutiny and refusing distortion. A person avoiding accountability says something like this: I'm not discussing this. A person protecting clarity might say something like this: I'll answer the concern, but I don't accept the premise of the question. That distinction matters. You're not running from the conversation. You are correcting the conditions under which the conversation will occur. Imagine someone asks, why did you ignore the warnings from your team? A weak response might be, I didn't mean to ignore anyone. There was a lot happening, and I may not have responded as quickly as I should have. It sounds reasonable. It may even sound humble, but it accepts the claim that warnings were ignored. A stronger response would be something like this: I don't agree with that. The warnings were ignored. 3 concerns were raised. 2 were incorporated into the revised plan, and the 3rd was rejected for a specific operational reason. I'm happy to explain that decision. Notice what happened. The speaker did not become hostile. They didn't attack the questioner, and they didn't evade the issue. They separated the legitimate concern from the false conclusion. This is conversational authority. Highly capable people are especially vulnerable to loaded questions because They believe good explanations will resolve bad framing. They think, once I provide the full context, everyone will understand. Once I explain my reasoning, the accusation will disappear. Once I show the evidence, the conversation will become fair. Sometimes it strengthens it. The longer you defend yourself inside someone else's premise, the more legitimate that premise begins to appear. Suppose someone asks, why is your department always behind schedule? You respond you respond with staffing details, supplier delays, technical problems, anything like that. You may provide 5 minutes of accurate information, but the room may remember only one thing. Your department is always behind schedule. You've supplied detail without correcting the headline. This is why the order of your response matters. And correct the frame first, then provide the explanation. Never bury the correction beneath the defense. When a question contains a false or distorted premise, use 3 moves. First, identify the premise. Second, correct it briefly. Third, answer the legitimate concern underneath it. For example, you get a question like this: why did you wait until the project was already failing before taking action? The premise is the project was failing and that you waited. You might respond, I wouldn't describe the project as failing, and we did not wait to act. We identified a scheduling risk during the second review and changed the deployment plan that week. The more useful question is whether that adjustment was sufficient. I believe it was, but here is what we should change next time. You've done 3 things. You've rejected the inaccurate description, you replaced it with verifiable structure, and you still engaged with the underlying concern. That part is essential. If you only reject the premise, you can sound evasive. If you reject the premise and address the real issue, you sound disciplined. Another example might be something like this: why are you so restrained to feedback? You could say, I'm not restrained to feedback. I disagree with the particular recommendation. Those are not the same thing. My concern is that it increases cost without resolving the underlying problem. Again, no anger, no apology, no lengthy defense of your character, just a clear distinction followed by a substantiative answer. Loaded questions become especially effective when they're delivered quickly. Someone interrupts you, they increase their volume, they demand a yes or no answer. They say something like, it's a simple question. Often it's not a simple question. It's a complex accusation compressed into a sentence. And the demand for speed is part of the strategy. Speed prevents examination. It pressures you to choose between 2 answers, both of which strengthen the questioner's position. Did you know your decision would hurt the team? Yes or no? If you say yes, you appear reckless. If you say no, you appear uninformed. But those are not necessarily the only possibilities. You might say, that question assumes the decision harmed the team. I don't accept that conclusion. It created a short-term disruption, but it prevented a much larger operational failure. The most powerful answer is sometimes neither yes nor no. It is refusal to enter a false choice. There is also a danger here. Once people learn to recognize loaded questions, they may start treating every challenging question as manipulative. That is not authority. That is fragility wearing strategic language. Sometimes the premise is accurate. Sometimes you did fail to prepare the team. Sometimes you were unwilling to compromise. Sometimes your judgment deserves to be questioned. Strong communicators do not automatically reject uncomfortable premises. They examine them. Ask yourself, is the premise factually inaccurate? Is it incomplete in a way that changes the meaning? Does it assign motive without evidence? Does it force me into choices that are not actually the only choices? Or do I simply dislike what the question reveals? The final question requires honesty. Refusing a false premise protects your authority. Refusing an accurate premise destroys your credibility. The skill is not learning how to escape questions. The skill is learning how to distinguish an honest challenge from a disguised conclusion. In high-stakes conversations, people listen closely to answers, but experienced communicators pay equal attention to the question because the question determines what must be defended. It determines what facts appear relevant. It determines who begins with legitimacy and who begins with suspicion. And it determines which version of reality enters the room first. So the next time someone asks you a difficult question, don't rush. Listen for the premise. Decide whether it's accurate. Correct it when necessary. Then answer the concern that deserves an answer. You do not demonstrate integrity by accepting every accusation placed inside a question. You demonstrate integrity by protecting the truth of the conversation even when the distortion is subtle, even when the pressure is high, and even when answering immediately would be easier. Not every question deserves the answer it demands. Sometimes the most honest response begins with something like this: that is not what happened. Sometimes it begins with, those are not the only two choices. And sometimes it begins with, I'll address the concern, but first we need to correct the premise. Because the person who controls the question often controls the conversation. Unless you recognize what the question is trying to make true, speak with intent.